Smoke was rising from only one chimney that morning. Just one for 4 homes. A boy stood in the snow with his boots not yet laced, staring up at a roofline that made no sense to him. 4 cabins stood in a loose half-circle, the way they always had. But the roofs no longer stopped at their own walls. They reached toward each other, joined at strange angles, covered in frost so even that it looked like a single structure wearing 4 different faces. He had watched this thing get built in pieces, in arguments, in silence. He had heard his father called a fool for it, twice, by men who were now standing very quietly near that one chimney, with their hands out toward the warmth. 3 families had said no before they said yes. One man had said it would kill them faster than the cold ever could. Nobody had explained to the boy why joining 4 roofs together would mean joining 4 families under one fire. Nobody had explained why the man who built it barely spoke about the winter he remembered as a child, in a place none of them had ever seen. All he knew was that 2 nights ago, the wind had turned, and someone almost sealed the wrong opening at the wrong time. He did not know that yet either. He only knew that the snow outside his own window had not melted the way it used to, right along one wall. Something about that wall had changed before anyone told him it would. If you're watching this from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where in the comments. Stories like this survive because people still remember them on purpose. And if frontier ingenuity like this means something to you, sticking around helps keep these stories alive. The valley had looked generous in August. That was the trouble with it. 4 families had come north together that year, drawn by land that was cheap for a reason nobody had bothered to explain out loud. Elias Voss had been the one who found it first, walking the tree line with a borrowed mule and a head full of plans. He was a blacksmith by trade, a carpenter by necessity, and by the time the others arrived, he had already convinced himself the valley could hold 4 homes and feed 4 fires. He had not counted the trees correctly. It was Henrik Bauer who noticed first, in the 2nd week of October, when he walked the ridge behind his own cabin and realized how little standing timber was left within a reasonable haul. The good stands had been cut low near the creek during the first summer, when everyone was building walls and nobody was thinking about January. What remained was scattered wet and far enough uphill that hauling it through snow would cost more strength than 4 families could spare. Henrik brought his measuring rope to Elias's door that evening, not to argue, but to show him the numbers. Between the 4 households, they had perhaps enough cut and split wood to keep one modest fire burning through a normal winter. Not 4 fires, not even 3, if the cold came early or stayed late, which in that country it often did. Elias sat with the rope in his hands for a long time before he spoke. He knew what 4 separate winters would cost. He had seen it before, though not in this country. Families burning through their wood by December, sending husbands out into storms to find more, some of them not coming back the same. He did not say any of that to Henrik. He only asked how much wood the women and children had gathered from deadfall, and the number was smaller than either man wanted to admit. That night, walking home past the other 3 cabins, Elias counted the chimneys. 4 separate columns of smoke, each one thin, each one working alone against the same sky. It struck him, standing there in the near dark, that the cold did not care how the wood was divided. It only cared whether there was enough heat, in one place or 4, to keep it out. By the time he reached his own door, he had the beginning of an idea that he was not yet ready to say aloud, because he knew exactly how it would sound to people who had crossed an ocean to have a home of their own. Walls that belonged to nobody else. He was about to ask them to give that up, at least for one winter, and he did not yet know how. He waited 3 days before he said it out loud, because he wanted to be certain he was not simply afraid of the cold talking. The 4 families gathered in Henrik's cabin, the largest of the 4, On a Sunday evening, when the wind was already testing the doorframe, Elias stood near the stove and said it plainly, the way his father had taught him to deliver bad news. No long introduction, no softening. He wanted to join the 4 roofs together. Not the walls, not the rooms, but the roofs, extended and connected above the space between the cabins, built around a single central hearth that all 4 families would share through the coldest months. 1 fire, 1 woodpile, 4 homes drawing warmth from a common source, the way he remembered it done in the hill villages of his childhood, where winters lasted long enough to make separate fires a luxury nobody could afford. The silence, after he finished, lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. Ingrid Zolberg spoke first, and not gently. She had left a well-built house behind to come to this valley, and she was not inclined to spend the only good years she had left living, in effect, inside her neighbor's business. Her husband, Anders, said less, but his face said enough. A shared roof meant shared noise, shared smoke, shared arguments about whose turn it was to feed the fire and whose children were too loud after dark. The 4th family, the Petersons, said almost nothing at all. Marta Peterson held her youngest son a little closer and looked at the floor, and Elias understood, without being told, that this family had the least wood of anyone in the room, and the least standing to argue about it. Henrik was the one who finally asked the question that mattered most. He asked what would happen if that single fire got out of control. 4 separate cabins meant 4 separate risks. 1 shared structure meant that whatever happened to the fire happened to everyone at once, and there would be no walking away from a neighbor's mistake this time. Elias did not have a clean answer for that, and he said so. He only said that a fire built carefully, watched by 4 households instead of 1 exhausted man in each cabin, might in fact be safer than 4 fires tended by 4 tired people falling asleep at the worst possible hour. It was not a promise. It was an argument, and he knew it was not yet a strong enough one to change anyone's mind that night. They did not agree to anything. They agreed only to think about it, which in that room, on that particular evening, was its own kind of small victory. Anders Solberg came to Elias's forge 2 mornings later, and he did not come to apologize for his silence at the meeting. He came with a list. He had spent the 2 days doing what Elias should have expected a careful man to do, counting costs instead of feelings. If the roofs were joined and something went wrong with the central fire, in a bad wind or a dry spell, all 4 families lost everything at once, instead of 1 family losing everything alone. That single fact, Anders said, standing with his arms crossed near the forge's heat, was reason enough to walk away from the entire idea. He was not finished. He asked what would happen when the Petersons' boy cried through the night, as young children do, in a structure where sound would travel between homes that had never been built to share it. He asked what would happen when Ingrid and Marta disagreed about how the fire should be tended, since both women had their own ways of doing things, and neither was inclined to be told otherwise by a neighbor. He asked, finally, what would happen to a man's pride, watching his own hearth become a shared arrangement instead of something that belonged only to his family. Elias listened to all of it without interrupting, because every point Anders raised was a fair one. He had turned them over himself in the dark more than once, and he had no honest answer that made the risks disappear. What he offered instead was smaller and more specific. He proposed that the roofs be built with separate sections that could be closed off from one another, so that each family kept a portion of privacy even while sharing the same source of heat. He proposed that the fire itself be tended on a rotation, written down and agreed upon in advance, so that no single family carried the burden or the authority alone. And on the matter of risk, he admitted plainly that there was no way to make a single shared fire as safe, in theory, as 4 fires spread apart. He could only argue that 4 exhausted households running out of wood by February was its own kind of danger, one that had already killed people in winters like this one, in valleys not unlike their own. Anders did not agree that day. He left the forge with his list still in his hand, unconvinced but no longer entirely dismissive. It was, Elias thought, watching him walk back toward his own cabin, the difference between a man who has decided against something and a man who is still doing arithmetic. There was still a chance the numbers would come out the right way. They met again 8 days later, and this time the conversation was less about fire and more about fairness. Henrik had the most standing timber left on his land, cut but not yet split, and he made it known that this counted for something in whatever arrangement they reached. The Petersons had almost no reserve wood at all, but Marta's husband, Joseph, was the only man among them who had built a working chimney before, back in the town they had left, and he offered that skill as his contribution instead of lumber he did not have. Ingrid and Anders had wood enough for perhaps 6 weeks on their own, and tools that none of the other families owned. What emerged, slowly and without much grace, was an uneven trade. Wood from one family, labor from another, tools from a third, and from Elias, the design itself along with whatever ironwork the joined structure would require from his forge. It was Marta who asked the question that quieted the table. She asked what would happen to a family that gave everything it had, wood and labor and pride, and still ended up with the coldest corner of the shared roof when winter arrived in earnest. She did not accuse anyone of planning it that way. She simply named the fear that had been sitting under the entire conversation since the first meeting, the fear that sharing a fire did not mean sharing it equally. Elias did not have a clever answer. He only said that the design would place the hearth as close to the center of the joined structure as the land allowed, so that no single cabin sat obviously closer to the source of heat than the others. It was the most honest promise he could make, and he knew even as he said it that the true test would not come from any drawing. It would come from whichever wall proved coldest once the first real frost arrived. The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous enthusiasm. It was closer to 4 households agreeing that the alternative, 4 separate fires stretched too thin across a hard winter, frightened them slightly more than the plan in front of them did. Henrik voted yes, because the numbers on his own woodpile told him he had no better option. Ingrid and Anders voted yes with visible reluctance, on the condition that their section of the roof could be sealed off whenever they wished. Marta and Joseph voted yes because they had the least to lose by trying, and the most to lose by refusing. Elias walked home that night past 4 cabins that had, for the first time since the families arrived in that valley, agreed on something larger than any one household's walls. He did not yet know how hard the ground would be to break, or how much the first attempt at the roof line would fail before it worked. The ground between the 4 cabins had never been meant to hold anything. It was a gathering space, worn flat by footsteps and firewood carts, and now it needed to carry the weight of a roof large enough to cover a distance no single family had ever built across. Elias marked the corners with his father's old measuring stick, the metal cold enough in the early morning to sting through his gloves. Henrik and Joseph worked the timber, dragging beams cut from the standing wood Henrik had offered, while Anders, true to the terms of the vote, kept close watch over every joint that touched his own cabin's wall. He said little, but he inspected everything, running his hand along each seam as though the wood itself might confess a weakness to him. The frame rose slowly, a skeleton of beams reaching from cabin to cabin, meeting somewhere near the center, where the shared hearth would eventually stand. From a distance, it looked less like a roof, and more like the ribs of something not yet alive, 4 separate structures beginning to breathe the same air for the first time. The women worked their own share of the labor, though nobody had asked them to. Ingrid hauled clay and moss for packing the seams where the new roof met the old walls, while Marta split kindling with a steadiness that surprised the men who had assumed, without saying so, that her small frame meant small strength. The Peterson boy, not yet old enough for real work, spent his days collecting the offcuts and stacking them by size, a habit nobody had taught him, and everybody quietly appreciated. It was slow, cold work, made slower by the fact that 4 families with 4 different habits were now required to agree on nearly everything. Where a beam should sit, how high the central peak should rise, whether a gap of 2 inches or 3 was safer for the eventual chimney. Small disagreements surfaced daily, and each one had to be settled before the work could continue, because unlike 4 separate homes, a mistake here belonged to everyone. Elias found himself mediating more than building some days. He did not mind it as much as he expected to. There was something in watching 4 households argue their way toward a single roof that felt less like conflict and more like 4 families slowly becoming one, whether they had intended that or not. By the 3rd week, the frame was complete enough to see its shape clearly for the first time. One continuous roof line joining 4 homes, angled to shed snow toward the open ground behind the cabins rather than toward the doors. At its center, where all 4 sections met, stood the rough outline of the shared hearth, not yet built, but already the place every conversation seemed to circle back to. Henrik stood beside Elias the evening the frame was finished and said, without much warmth, that it looked like something that might actually work. It was not praise exactly, but it was the closest thing to it that Elias had heard from him since the whole idea began. They lit the first fire on a night colder than any that had come before it, because Elias wanted to test the system before real winter forced the question. The hearth stood finished at the center of the joined roof, built from stone hauled up from the creek bed, and mortared with clay that had taken 2 full days to mix and pack correctly. Above it, a single chimney rose through the peak where all 4 roof sections met, designed to draw smoke upward and away from every home at once instead of 1 chimney per cabin working alone. For the first hour, it worked exactly as Elias had hoped. Warmth spread outward along the shared roof line, and for the first time since the families had arrived in that valley, 4 households sat inside a structure that felt, if only briefly, like a single home. Then the wind shifted. It came from the north instead of the west, the direction nobody had planned for, and within minutes smoke began curling back down through the seam where Anders and Ingrid's section met the central peak. It did not billow. It crept, thin and gray, settling low along the ceiling of their portion of the shared roof before anyone noticed what was happening. Ingrid noticed first, coughing before she understood why, and by the time Anders threw open the shutter to clear the air, the damage to the evening was already done. The smoke cleared within minutes once the opening let it escape, but the fear it left behind did not clear nearly as fast. Anders did not shout. He did not need to. He simply looked at Elias across the fire-lit room and said that this was exactly what he had warned them about, back at the forge, weeks before any of this was built. 1 fire, 1 mistake, and every family in the room breathing the consequences of it together. Elias examined the seam by lantern light once the others had gone quiet, running his hand along the joint the way Anders had once run his hand along every beam during construction. He found nothing broken, no obvious flaw in the carpentry. The wood was sound. The clay packing held. Whatever had gone wrong wasn't a matter of something failing, but of something missing, some detail in how the air was meant to move that he had not accounted for. He did not sleep that night. He sat by the dying hearth, long after the others had returned to their own corners of the shared roof, turning the problem over the way his father had once taught him to turn over a piece of iron that would not hold its shape, searching not for what was broken, but for what he had failed so far to understand. It came to him 2 days later, not while he was working, but while he was doing nothing at all, sitting outside his own cabin watching smoke rise from a neighbor's chimney a valley away. He was a boy again, for a moment, in the hill country where he had been born, in a village where winters lasted long enough that firewood was measured as carefully as grain. He remembered the cluster of stone houses near the church, built close together and joined at the roofline in a way he had never thought to question as a child, because it was simply how things had always been done there. What he remembered now, watching that distant chimney smoke bend sideways in the valley wind, was the shape of the vents built into those old roofs. They had not been placed where the builders wanted them for convenience. They had been placed according to which direction the mountain wind most often turned in the coldest months, with smaller openings positioned to let heavy, damp air escape low, near the base of the roofline, rather than relying entirely on a single central chimney to carry everything upward at once. He had built one opening, one main path for smoke and air, and had assumed it would be enough because it had seemed enough in his own cabin, alone, for years. He had not accounted for what happened when 4 households breathed, cooked, and burned wood together under one shared roof, all of that air needing somewhere to go besides a single overworked chimney that could be defeated by a single change in wind. The old builders had never explained this to him in words. He had only watched it, as a child watches everything, without understanding why it mattered until the day it mattered enormously. He returned to the shared roof the next morning with a plan that was smaller than the first one, but, he suspected, more important. Rather than depending entirely on the central chimney, he wanted to cut a secondary vent low along the northern seam, the same seam that had failed 2 nights earlier, positioned specifically to let heavy air escape before it had the chance to settle and turn back into the rooms below. Henrik was skeptical. Cutting into a roof that had already taken 3 weeks to build, in the coldest part of the year, for a fix Elias could not fully explain, in terms any of them found familiar, was not an easy thing to agree to. But Anders, of everyone, was the one who eventually nodded first. He had spent 2 nights since the smoke incident watching his wife flinch at every gust of wind against their walls, and whatever pride remained in him mattered less than an actual answer to the problem. They began cutting the new vent that same afternoon, racing whatever time remained before the valley's first true blizzard arrived. The vent was smaller than the chimney, no wider than a forearm, cut low along the northern seam, and fitted with a simple wooden flap that could be opened or closed by hand from inside. Elias explained it as plainly as he could to the 4 families gathered beneath it. The vent was not there to bring in cold air, though it would, in small amounts. It was there to give the heaviest, dampest air inside the shared roof a way out close to the ground, before it had the chance to cool, settle, and drift back down into the rooms where people slept. The chimney alone had been asking too much of itself, trying to carry everything upward through one narrow path, no matter which way the wind was blowing that night. Anders watched the work more closely than anyone, arms crossed the same way they had been at the forge weeks earlier, waiting to see whether this explanation held up any better than the roof itself had, 2 nights before. They tested it that evening with a smaller fire than before. Cautious, the way a person tests a bridge they are not yet certain will hold their weight. For the first 2 hours, nothing unusual happened. The wind stayed mild, and the chimney did its work without complaint. Then, near midnight, the wind turned north again, the exact condition that had filled Ingrid and Anders's section with smoke days earlier. This time, The smoke thinned instead of gathering. A faint gray line drew itself toward the new vent along the northern seam and slipped out through the wooden flap, rather than settling along the ceiling the way it had before. It was not a dramatic difference to watch. It was, if anything, almost disappointingly quiet. The sort of success that looks like nothing happened at all. Anders stood beneath the vent for a long time that night, saying nothing, watching the faint gray line of air disappear through an opening the width of his own forearm. When he finally spoke, it was not an apology, and not quite praise either. He said only that he would be watching it again tomorrow night, and the night after that, before he was willing to call it solved. Elias understood. One quiet night did not undo 2 nights of fear, and he had learned by now that trust, once shaken under a shared roof, did not return simply because a single test had gone well. What he did not say aloud, though he thought it clearly enough that night, was that the real test was still ahead of them. A calm evening with a small fire was not the same as a full winter storm testing every seam, every joint, and every family's patience at once. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the valley's first true blizzard was still gathering, and it was in no hurry at all. The first true cold arrived without much warning, the way it often did in that country, dropping hard over a single night and staying long enough to make the earlier tests feel almost gentle by comparison. For 3 days, the shared roof held steady. Henrik's section, closest to the hearth, stayed warm enough that his family stopped bothering with extra blankets by the second night. Joseph and Marta's cabin, though farther from the center, benefited from the chimney work Joseph himself had helped design, and the new northern vent kept their air clean even when the wind gusted hard against that side of the structure. Anders and Ingrid, whose section had failed first, now ran warmer and drier than either of them had expected. And Anders, though he did not say so directly, stopped inspecting the seams every evening the way he had for the first 2 weeks. It was the 4th cabin, Elias's own, that revealed the problem nobody had anticipated. His section sat at the far end of the joined roof line, the farthest point from the central hearth, and while the shared warmth reached it well enough on mild nights, the deep cold exposed a stretch of wall near his sleeping quarters that stayed noticeably colder than the rest of the structure. It was not smoke this time, and it was not a design flaw in the venting. It was distance, plain and simple. The same problem Marta had named weeks earlier at the cold table when she asked what would happen to whichever family ended up farthest from the source of heat. Elias had assured her the hearth's central placement would prevent exactly this outcome. He had believed it when he said it. Now, running his hand along his own cold wall in the gray hours before dawn, he understood that placement alone had not been enough. Warmth did not travel evenly through a joined structure this large, no matter how carefully the hearth was centered, and the family occupying the farthest point would always feel the difference first. He said nothing to the others that day, turning the problem over privately, unwilling yet to admit that the design he had defended so confidently still had a weakness nobody had caught in time. It was a small mercy that the flaw had appeared in his own home, rather than someone else's. A smaller mercy still that the true test of the winter had not yet arrived. Whatever solution existed for the cold corner of the shared roof, he would need to find it before the valley's worst weather made the question urgent rather than merely uncomfortable. He did not know, standing in that cold corner at first light, that urgency was closer than he expected, and that it would not announce itself through his own wall, but through someone else's child. It began as a small sound, the kind easy to dismiss in a house full of ordinary winter noises. The Peterson boy, not yet 6 years old, had been coughing for 2 nights before Marta said anything to anyone outside her own family. She told herself, at first, that it was nothing more than the dry air near their section of the shared roof. made worse by the wood smoke that lingered longer on especially cold nights. Joseph told himself the same thing, checking on his son each night before returning to whatever work still needed finishing before the deep winter arrived in full. By the third night, the cough had changed, deepening into something that kept the boy from settling into real sleep. Marta sat beside him with a cup of warm water and a cloth soaked in melted snow pressed gently to his forehead, doing what she could with what little the valley offered them, while Joseph went to fetch Elias without waiting for morning. Elias arrived to find the boys' section of the shared roof colder than it should have been, colder even than his own troubled corner had been days earlier. The Petersons' cabin sat on the opposite end of the structure from Elias's, and though it was closer to the central hearth than his own section, it caught the worst of the wind funneling down from the ridge in a way none of the earlier tests had accounted for. Marta did not raise her voice, but her eyes carried the same accusation Anders had voiced weeks before at the forge, back when this had still been only an argument about wood and pride. Now it was her son shivering under a shared roof that 4 families had agreed to trust, and the fear in her face made it clear that trust could be withdrawn as quickly as it had been given. Elias examined the wall near the boy's bed by lantern light, running his hand along the seam the way he had done on every cold night since the roof was finished. He found no obvious failure, no gap in the construction. What he found instead was a section of wall thinner than the rest, built early in the process before the families had settled on the final design, never reinforced the way the other seams had been once the plan matured. It was not a mystery of engineering. It was a small human oversight, made weeks earlier when 4 exhausted families were still arguing about wood shares and fairness, rather than thinking carefully about every inch of what they were building. He told Joseph and Marta the truth of it that night, without softening it. The wall could be reinforced, packed with additional clay and moss before the next hard freeze, but it needed to happen quickly, and it needed to hold through whatever weather came next. Because the boy's cough was already a warning the valley had sent them once, and neither Elias nor anyone else standing in that room believed it would be polite enough to send a second one. Somewhere past the ridge, the sky had already begun to change color in a way the older families in the valley had learned, over hard winters, not to ignore. It came 2 nights later, exactly as the color of that sky had warned. The wind arrived first, hours before the snow, pressing against the shared roof with a steady weight that made the whole structure creak in ways it had not creaked before. By the time the snow began falling in earnest, visibility outside had dropped to almost nothing, and all 4 families had already gathered closer to the central hearth than the rotation schedule technically required, drawn there by instinct more than agreement. For the first several hours, the joined roof held exactly as it had during the milder tests. The chimney drew smoke steadily upward. The northern vent did its quiet work, releasing heavy air before it could settle. The reinforced wall near the Peterson section, packed hastily with fresh clay 2 days earlier, showed no sign yet of the cold that had frightened Marta so badly. Then, somewhere near midnight, the wind did what it had done once before. It turned. This time it did not simply shift from west to north. It began gusting unpredictably, first from one direction and then another, testing every seam in the structure the way a hand tests a lock it does not fully trust. Ingrid noticed the change first, the same way she had noticed the smoke weeks earlier, and called out before anyone else fully understood what was happening. Elias moved through the shared structure in near darkness, checking each seam by touch rather than sight, the lantern light too weak against a wind this strong to be much use at all. At Elias's own cold corner, the wall held. At the northern vent, the wooden flap strained against gusts stronger than any it had faced in testing, but it held too, letting damp air escape in short bursts between each surge of wind. It was near the Petersons' reinforced wall that the real danger appeared. The fresh clay, still not fully cured after only 2 days, had begun to crack under the combined pressure of cold, wind, and the structure's own settling weight. A thin line of freezing air was finding its way through, and inside, the boy had started coughing again. Worse than before, his small body already weakened by the illness of the past several nights. Elias faced a choice with no clean answer. Sealing the crack completely risked trapping smoke and damp air inside with nowhere to escape, repeating the very failure that had frightened everyone weeks earlier. Leaving it open risked worsening the boy's illness through a night that showed no sign of easing before dawn. There was no time to test a careful solution. There was only time to choose and live with whatever the choice cost. He chose to pack the crack with dry moss rather than wet clay, a temporary seal that would block the worst of the wind without fully closing the seam. Buying time rather than promising a permanent fix. It was not the solution he would have chosen with daylight and calm weather to think it through. It was the only solution the night allowed. Then there was nothing left to do but wait. 4 families crowded close around a single fire, listening to a storm that gave no indication of how the night would end. Morning came slowly, the way it often does after a night that felt as though it might not end at all. The wind had eased sometime before dawn, though none of the 4 families had slept enough to notice exactly when. Elias was the first outside, stepping into snow deep enough to reach his knees, looking up at a roof line that had somehow survived a night it had never been fully tested against before. The moss seal near the Pattersons' wall had held. It was not a permanent repair, and Elias knew it would need proper work once the weather allowed. But it had done exactly what a temporary answer was meant to do. Inside, the boy's cough had quieted sometime in the early hours, and though Marta would not call him fully recovered for several more days, the worst of the fear that had gripped her 2 nights earlier had eased along with the wind. Henrik walked the length of the shared roof that morning, checking every visible seam the way he had checked his own woodpile weeks earlier, back when the numbers alone had convinced him to vote yes. He found cracks here and there, small ones, the kind any structure built quickly under hard conditions would carry after its first true storm. But the roof had held where it mattered, and 4 chimneys, joined into one working system, had carried 4 families through a night that would have tested even well-stocked, well-built homes standing separately. Anders came to Elias later that morning without the list he had once brought to the forge. He said only that he had checked his own wall 3 times overnight, out of habit more than fear, and each time it had stayed dry and warm. He did not say he had been wrong weeks earlier. His objections had been fair ones, and the roof's near failures over the preceding weeks had proven that fairness more than once. What he said instead was that he was glad, this particular morning, that the argument had ended the way it had. Word of the blizzard, and of what 4 joined roofs had survived, traveled slowly through the wider valley over the following weeks, the way news does in places where neighbors are measured in miles rather than doorsteps. A family 2 ridges over sent word asking whether Elias would be willing to explain the design, once the worst of winter had passed, and there was time enough to talk it through properly. Elias never called the roof a triumph. Not that winter, and not in the years after. He called it, when asked, simply an answer to a problem that 4 families could not have solved alone, each burning through their own small store of wood, while the same cold worked patiently against every wall it could find. The valley remembered that blizzard for years, the way hard winters are remembered in places where they are not uncommon. But what the 4 families remembered more clearly, long after the details of the storm had faded, was the particular quiet of that following morning. 4 homes, 1 fire, and warmth that had somehow, against every fair objection raised against it, made it all the way through. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.